understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. I have a question to ask you. What do you do when an old mate says to you, "You'd have made a great queen"? So John and I are sitting here. I'll give you the backdrop. We're sitting here in the new HQ. I've spruced it up, right?
Yes,
I've
looking
spruced up the
very
basement,
nice.
right? I changed it all around. And I'm admitting to John that yesterday I had a sort of a baptism of fire because I'm trying to do bits and pieces of DIY in the house, John, and that's not really me, right?
It's not at all.
It's not me. I found myself in a place, a very strange tabernacle called Screwfit, which is
You were out of place
a
there.
real DIY man's place. And I broke out in a cold sweat, right? And I realized that not only was I out of place, but I hadn't a rashes what was going on, A, but B, more importantly, they knew that I hadn't a rashes what was going on, right?
There's a kind of a language that you have to use in those
You're
places.
absolutely right. So, of course, as a result of this, I was saying, John, I was explaining this to John, I said, actually, I wrote a chapter about being lost in woodies in The Pope's Children, right?
Yeah,
Because again, this was a character I'd created called DIY Declan.
that's right.
Right?
Yeah,
And we all
yeah.
know and now I've just got out The Pope's Children, right? And I'm reading it. And it's exactly this, right?
Yeah.
I said woodies, but I should have been Screwfit.
Yeah.
In woodies, DIY Declan, is at home. He has a mission. The gazebo that he's about to build will be built raised above the existing cedarwood deck. He'll make it with tropical hardwood. The contrasts will show off his fine workmanship, which, like his internal audit skills at work, is meticulous. Only after he's bought the wood, talked knowledgeably about the designs, the curves, the railings, only after he has mentioned fast-setting concrete at least a dozen times, establishing his bona fides with other deckmen who hang out in woodies on Sundays, he will choose something as frivolous as a grill. The key to a successful and enriching day at woodies is never to come looking for something assembled. It is also crucial to be seen as a DIY man of substance. You have to be pitching roofs, making furniture, laying blocks, or putting down railway sleepers. Merely buying grills, patio heaters, and grass seeds doesn't count. Real DIY men are confident and always calls the sales assistants loudly by their name tags in that overtly chummy DIY way. Right. Now, to which John said, "You're very bitchy, Mac. You would have made a great queen." So I was queening around this fucking Screwfit yesterday, feeling, where is the library? I just want to read a book.
Have you any literature on
Yeah. I mean,
on
any
4x4s?
Steinbeck. Exactly. So that was a chapter on DIY Declan in The Pope's Children. I also said, only woody aficionados are here. You are now in the zone, which is for men only, men who work with their hands and subscribe to Power Tools Monthly.
Ooh, ouch.
Now, so John has changed my entire personality. He's taken the bitchiness out of me, the cattiness, the queen out of me. The straightest queen you've ever met.
Yes, there you go. There he
Anyway,
is.
it is lovely to have you in the podcast. We are now luxuriant in our new basement, and we want to talk about the Trump dump, John.
Right, okay.
So the Trump dump is what is happening in the world right now, which is financial markets are rejecting Donald Trump. And
Right.
Donald Trump is a man whose scorecard has always been, I'm the stock market guru.
Mm.
And what you're seeing across...
And talking about bitchy men.
Well, exactly. But across the world, remember we talked about the mass extinction event last week?
Yeah.
This mass extinction event is coming closer and closer. So I want to talk about the dynamic between the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and the king, Donald Trump. And I want to tell you, we've seen this dynamic before and it didn't end well.
Oh?
We've seen this dynamic. the early 18th century between John Law, who was the richest man in the world for a short period of time, and how he got inside the head of the regent of France, the Duke of Orléans, who was running France. Exactly the same dynamic.
Right.
And in the same way that Elon Musk has convinced Donald Trump that he is the future, Musk is, and Trump can ride into the coattails of this incredibly wealthy man, Law did exactly the same with the French court, and the whole thing ended in tragedy. And I suspect this is exactly where we're going with the Musk-Trump dynamic.
If there's one thing I've learned with doing this podcast over the last 5+ years, is history is repeating itself.
First as tragedy, then as farce, as Marx said. Always get Marx in there. Right, but I want to give you some numbers as to what's happening, right? All around the world, financial markets, risky assets are tanking, right? Whether that's Bitcoin, whether it's the Indian stock market, whether it's the Japanese stock market, whether it's the NASDAQ, which has been completely hosed. It's this mass extinction event, and it comes from a very basic idea. Warren Buffett once said beautifully about crashes and booms and busts. He said, "It is only when the tide goes out do you know who's swimming in the nude." And I suspect Musk is swimming in the nude, or the acolytes around him. Because what is happening now is something not dissimilar to 2008. It's only beginning to start.
Yeah.
Just mark my words. You heard it first on the podcast, right? What happens is once highly leveraged, i.e. highly borrowed positions in a bull stampede like the NASDAQ, which of course is the tech market in the States, once they begin to turn, if the central bank does not print new dollars to bail out all those borrowers, they're called investors, but all they were fellas who borrowed other people's money to buy stuff that was going up, right? Once the central bank doesn't do this, doesn't bail them out, as it did in 2009, 2010, 2011, when Bernanke announced QE, which was basically a cash for trash scheme for American assets, right? Jay Powell shows no intention of doing this. In fact, Jay Powell has got many reasons to be quite vengeful towards Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has consistently humiliated him, undermined him, told him, we're going to tolerate you from now. So once you get a change in the dynamic, do you ever see those bulls running in Pamplona, right? And everyone's brave until the fucking bull catches them up the arse, right?
Yeah.
Once that happens, you need somebody to come in and stop the race.
With a big plaster.
That's exactly. Or with something to freak out the bulls to stop the race, right?
Yeah.
So Powell has no intention of doing that. And then what happens is those losses turn into margin call problems because the borrowed money has to be paid back. Therefore, the assets have to be sold quicker to generate the cash to pay them back. And we are into a very different world.
But can I ask you, when, the big promise of Trump coming in was to the stock market and to the corporate world in general, when he was inaugurated, the stock market went up. It ticked up, didn't it?
Buy the rumor, sell the fact. One of the greatest lines in investment.
But what was the point when they kind of went, whoa, hang on, because it's what, just over a month, coming up to 2 months?
It's a month to 6 weeks ago. There was this effervescence, the silliness. But now people are looking and saying, hold on.
It changed quickly.
It does change quickly. And the reason it changed quickly is the following. Number one, I'm not saying the United States is going to go into recession, but it's weakening quickly. The economy is weakening quickly. So across the board, house sales, very, very weak, which is a dreadful leading indicator for a country that has borrowed. We'll see what happens in employment. We'll see what happens in retail sales. But what is happening is the following. Trump and Musk are chaos monkeys. They thrive on chaos. And media, our business, thrives on chaos. But fundamental business thrives on stability. So if you are, for example, a big investor and you have a factory, you have a big company, right, or a multinational, What you want to know is what they call in the corporate world visibility.
Yeah.
You want to know, well, in 4 years' time, if I put a factory in Mexico, that'll be fine.
Yeah. So
Or
your projected
Canada.
figures make sense.
You can see a bit into the future. Or
Yeah.
at least you can create forecasts that make sense. So what you want is stability, you want predictability, you want churn in technology, which gives you the possibility to be productive. But in general, you don't want madness, right? Look at what's happening. Trump puts tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Then he doesn't. Then he says he's going to put tariffs on Europe. He hasn't done so yet. Then he says to the British yesterday, don't worry, we might put tariffs on you.
Yeah.
Then he guts big parts of the American bureaucracy, right? With no real plan other than just, let's cut them back.
Yeah.
Creating chaos all the time. The one thing he's done in the last couple of days, there have been rumors coming out of Mar-a-Lago. It's a thing called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is that one part of their financial architecture will be the following, which will be trying to coax holders of American short-term bonds, 5 or 10 years, that have to be paid in the next 5 or 10 years, to swap those bonds for 100-year bonds.
That are never paid.
That will not be paid for 100 years, right? Now, you will still get the stream of income coming from the coupon, but that's in effect a default. Because if you think a default on debt is you do not uphold the contract. So you said you're going to pay back in 5 years' time at this rate of interest, right? But of course, because the American debt mountain is so big, what they're trying to do is swap today's delinquency for tomorrow's promise. Now, if that, it's only a rumor coming out.
Yeah.
But I've heard it from guys who are dealing on bond desks.
How could they, or how can they force that to happen?
They will change the taxation rate on the various things. So they'll say, if you swap for 100-year bonds, you'll pay 0 withholding tax. If you hold your 5-year bonds, we'll change it. They'll do something.
Right. Okay.
So, but my point is, this is as detrimental to the financial architecture of the United States as tariffs on Ireland is, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a total change. And of course, the American long bond, 30-year or 10-year bond, is the foundational price of the entire global capitalist system. And if you change that, because it's what's called, it's the risk-free return. So the risk-free return is the following. The Americans never devalue and never default. So there's no risk in American bonds.
Yeah.
So if you say, I'm going to given 3% rate of interest by the Americans, that is a risk-free rate of return. And that forms the foundational price of all long-term assets all around the world, right? But if they start swapping 10-year bonds for 100-year bonds, this is a complete betrayal of that trust.
So they lose all credibility. So how would the bond market react?
The bond
to
market
that?
will react very badly. So I think what we're seeing now is a lot of people waking up and saying, hold on a second. All this chaos might be great for the court of King Donny. And it makes great Twitter / X news or Instagram posts or whatever. But actually, instability is bad because instability is chaos, and chaos means I can't invest. And what do? You don't invest. So large companies hoard their money rather than investing. This feeds into an economy that's already showing signs of slowing down. Why? Because it has been driven hot by both Biden and now Trump, Part 2, he wants to drive it hot for a long, long time. And have the problem of inflation. And tariffs make inflation worse. So stagflation is a potential economic reality for America. If that is the case, everybody now is beginning to panic. And this is what you're seeing in the NASDAQ. This is what you're seeing all around the world. People thinking, hold on a second. The blue skies that Donny promised us all don't look very blue. There's clouds, storms, there's all sorts of things. And at the core of this is his relationship with another narcissistic man who has got very, very poor impulse control.
Yes.
Who is our friend Musk.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about that relationship in this podcast.
Just before you do that, can I just ask you, the hedge against inflation and chaos and all the rest was Bitcoin.
That's been collapsing.
But that's my question. Why is Bitcoin collapsing?
So we talked about the risk-free return.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a concept called return-free risk? Bitcoin pays you nothing.
Yeah.
There's no rate of interest in Bitcoin. All it is a speculative bet that the next fellow who comes in will pay you more.
Yeah.
So what Bitcoin needs, or any speculative asset needs, is calm, reasonably low interest rates, and a perception that everything in the future is going to be hunky-dory.
Yeah.
Now, what has happened with Bitcoin is people are saying, well, hold on a second. Bitcoin is really a highly risky asset. Are we in a risk-on or risk-off world?
Right.
If you're in a risk-off world, Bitcoin goes up. But now risks are everywhere. And people say, do you know what I'd like? Do you know that old-fashioned thing called income? That'd be really nice.
Yeah.
You know, if I give you money, you give me a rate of interest. If I give you money, you give me a stock that's growing. If I give you money, you give me really old-fashioned things like dividends, right?
Yeah. So I can just get on with my life, watch the football, go for a walk, and not think about anything.
Exactly. Right? So that's what's happening.
Yeah.
So all of this is coming 6 weeks after the inauguration, and it's all directly stemming from the chaos. And as I said 4 weeks ago, macroeconomics puts manners on bullshitters. And I think that's where we are going now. We're going to see a series of economic shocks that will affect the MAGA movement. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to derail it. They will affect it. They will affect the background noise. And this week, I just got an email, actually, from a mate of mine, Jim Chanos, who was on this podcast, a great short seller.
Yes.
And he said to me, has there ever been, David, in your experience, a private citizen as powerful as Elon Musk, as deeply embedded undemocratically within the system? And I was scratching my head. He says, yes, there has. You've written about him. John Law.
Right. Okay.
So what's fascinating about Musk, the richest man in the world, has a technological edge over other people, has had quite a stellar career as a speculator, entrepreneur, inventor, disruptor, and has a philosophy that's aligned with Donald Trump. Plus, in the United States, when you're the richest man in the world, you are regarded as infallible. Whereas if you're the richest man in the world in Europe, you're regarded with suspicion.
Yes.
Right? Okay,
Yes,
it's the European way. It's the European way, right? So what I find really intriguing is the dynamic between the state and the richest man. And if the state becomes captured by the ambitions, by the narcissism, by the genius, if you will, of the richest man, the state becomes imperiled, not the richest man, because the state can't move. The state is responsible for generations and generations and generations. And I think what we're seeing in the United States is the American Republic, and don't forget, it's a republic. Yeah. And the American Constitution was set up so that incredibly rich men wouldn't dominate. And the American Republic has been, in a way, taken hostage. In the same way as the French court, the King of France, was taken hostage by John Law, the American Republic has been taken hostage by an oligarchy of rich men, the richest of which is Elon Musk. Not only is this not good for democracy, I think because once you set aside your critical faculties about the ability of an individual, you get groupthink. And what you're going to get at the court of Donny is groupthink around Elon Musk, the same way as you had groupthink around John Law, with calamitous consequences. At a time when America is over-leveraged, is over-borrowed, is running a massive, massive budget deficit, massive current account deficit, and simply is living without earning its living. So it is borrowed. Its stock market is over-leveraged. Its bond market is weakened. And all the while, you're throwing chaos upon chaos upon chaos. But the fascinating thing about Musk and Law is Law promised a different future. He said, I have seen the future, and I know that we will be enriched enormously by this technology. Musk claims the same. He has seen the future. And follow me. Whether it's an AI future, an electric car future, a technocracy, an accelerating future, a libertarian future, it is a combination of economics, finance, and ideology that has galvanized a movement around him.
Right.
And that's the similarity. It's definitely worth exploring.
Well, let's look at the parallels and similarities between John Law and Elon Musk after this. So, Mark, you're saying there is this similarity between John Law in the 18th century and Elon Musk in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
So
I can see these parallels and I can see the story playing out.
Okay.
Okay.
First of all, give us a quick rundown of who John Law is.
John Law, Scottish murderer.
We stepped right into the murder.
Yeah. Accused of murder, had to flee Britain, ends up all around Europe, goes to Amsterdam first because, again, Amsterdam was the center of finance. Yeah. Very brilliant economist, very brilliant mathematician, very brilliant gambler, incredibly wealthy man.
Yeah.
But as well as his instinct for gambling, he also had an instinct for economics, which puts him as one of the great thinkers of economics. So he is like Musk, he's a complicated, complex, fascinating, definitely genius type character. But once someone like this gets in control of the society and on an intellectual whim drives the state, you have problems. So Law is kicked out of England.
Yeah.
Can't go back to Scotland. He's like an itinerant gambler. Venice, Amsterdam, Paris, mooching around. But he has one big idea. And this big idea is revolutionary. His idea is the following, is that money is a liberating force. It's an energy. All the stuff I write about in the book.
Yeah.
And if we can get money into more people's hands, the economy itself will respond in a very dynamic way because it will release the animal spirits that Keynes talk about, the gales of destruction, and it will create this positive self-reinforcing dynamic. But the problem is we, as in they at the time, tied money to gold, silver, or copper called species. Right? And the problem with this is there's only so much of that around. So Law thought, hold on a second, why be hamstrung? Why be hostage to the existing supply of gold? Can we not do something else?
Yeah.
Can we not create money out of somewhere else? Now, Marco Polo had seen the Chinese do this with paper money. So these ideas were flickering around Europe, but nobody had quite figured out what to do.
Or how to do it. Yeah.
And no country was prepared to back this guy, except for France. Now, France was the second most populous country in Europe and the most powerful, but had huge economic problems, right? The problems were the following. Do you remember the Sun King, Louis XIV?
Yes.
So Louis XIV dies in 1715, leaving the country bankrupt because Louis loved a banquet,
He did.
a gargle, and a war. Loved a bit of war.
And lots of glitz.
Loved glitz. He's like Donald. He's the Mar-a-Lago, right?
Yeah.
Versailles was the Mar-a-Lago, right?
Yes,
He loves it, right? Exactly the same sort of character. He dies. He leaves the regent, the Duke of Orléans, to run the place. Now, the problem was France needed an injection of sort of economic magic.
Yeah.
Why? Because first, they had always got a shortage of silver and gold in France because French aristocrats hoarded their silver and gold. And they had a second problem, which was a very high level of state indebtedness because the state was always borrowing from the aristocrats and borrowing from the Calvinists in Switzerland, right?
Right, okay.
Because the Calvinists in Switzerland were very good at banking, the Huguenots, and they actually became the backbone of banking in the city when the French kicked them all out. So they have a long history in this, right?
Right.
But so you have two problems. You haven't enough money and you have a massive national debt. Law said, I can fix both of those for you. In the same way as Musk is saying, don't worry about technology, I can fix it. Don't worry about AI, I can fix it. Don't worry about sending satellites to the moon, I can fix it, right?
Yeah, don't worry about the population. I have 11 kids and growing.
Maybe 15 kids.
Yeah.
And all the baby mamas around the place.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what he does, Law convinces the king, like Musk has done, to give him a job. Like a job. In the same way as Musk is now the head of Doge.
Yeah.
Same idea. Trump said, we need to cut back on federal waste, give a job. The Duke of Orléans, the regent, said, we need to fix these two problems. So he says to Law, can you fix it? And Law says, yeah. He said, how are you going to fix it? He says, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to set up a new bank called the General Bank. And this bank is going to be based on the Bank of England, which has been set up about 30 years prior to this. And what we'll do is we'll convince the very, very wealthy people in France, the aristocracy, to give us their gold and silver. And in return, we'll give them shares.
Yeah.
Right. So they will actually own the capital of this bank. And then this bank can begin the process of issuing paper money to people.
Right.
Now, how do we do that? We basically tell everybody that the paper money is backed by gold and silver. So they say, okay, this is fine. So the first part of the plan begins to work. 1717, 1718, a huge increase in the French money supply by this new bank, the General Bank. Law omits to tell the aristocracy there's only two actual owners of the shares, ultimately, two directors, himself and the king.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Very Musk-esque.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very Musk. Saying, Donny, do you want a kickback here? Donny says, yeah, for sure, I'll have a kickback. Okay? So away they go. So that's the first problem. And the interesting thing is it solves France's first dilemma. Money comes into the circulation because they've managed to convince the aristocrats to give them the gold and silver. They've convinced people that the money they're using is backed by gold and silver, and away they go, right? So French traders and entrepreneurs and business folk begin to start taking risks, bringing more products to the markets, and financing new trade routes, which was the other part, right?
Right. Okay.
The trade routes were to the Caribbean,
Yeah.
and to French Louisiana, and to French Canada, right? All places that people were beginning to dream big about the world, right? So the French had looked down their nose on the Spaniards for years, and what they couldn't understand was Spain had become incredibly rich in the last 100 years by plundering the gold of the Aztecs, the Incas, all this thing. And the French said, we want a bit of that action, you know. We're France, we're the biggest country in Europe. We're top dogs, you know. We're going around in all sorts of sort of tight trousers, tight little French
wigs.
Yeah, wigs and powdered wigs and all that good shit, right? So they wanted that. B, coming from Canada at the time in particular, was fur and lumber in enormous quantities. And the French thought, okay, there's lots going on over there.
Yeah.
And then coming from the Caribbean, sugar,
Yeah.
was cotton. They were getting spices from around Borneo. All these things they were thinking, okay, hold on a second. There is endless wealth in the new world. The new world is the future. So if you were in a coffee house in Paris, the sugar came from the new world. The coffee came from the new world.
Yeah.
You're thinking, okay, hold on a second. If we can just get a piece of this. So this is the sort of Muskian idea that there is a new world just out there. It's a technocracy. It's AI. You just have a piece of this, everything will be solved. Law is sitting in Paris thinking, okay, now, Parisians love the promise of the new world. Can I figure out a way of reducing the national debt, which is my second problem, by using the new world? He thinks, okay, if I can convince people to swap their government debt, which they own, for shares in a new company, and those shares are promising the riches of the new world into the future, what I can do is I can swap government debt for these new shares, and then that will reduce the government debt, that will eliminate French government debt, and everybody will be in this new project. So imagine this would be a bit like saying to the Americans today, if you hold American government debt, I'll give you shares in Apple, or I'll give you shares in AIX or something, right?
Yeah.
And why would you hold these stodgy bonds in the government which only give you 3 or 4% when you can own the future?
Yeah.
So he was a great salesman. So he says, yeah, but shit, I need a company to do this. And he sets up a company. He buys a company in Louisiana, French Louisiana, called the Company of the West. And through this company, he starts to sell the future to French people. Now, Louisiana then covered a territory that was half the size of America. Basically, if you think of a map of America, you're in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And you go up the Mississippi River all the way up to the top, and everything to the left of that, as you look at it, was French.
Over to the Rockies.
Over to the Rockies. Everything was French, right? And everything to the right was British.
Yeah.
So this was a massive tract of land. So what law says to people is you buy shares in this new company and you will have a purchase on the wealth of the new world for centuries.
Yeah.
Because we, France, own it. Now, of course, there was a slight dilemma of the American indigenous peoples and all those other things. But the idea is we will plunder it, right? And this captured the imagination of French people. Now, as the shares continue to rise, you get the FOMO.
Yeah.
The fear of missing out. Everyone's sitting in cafes, drinking wine, drinking coffee, saying, have you not got your bits and pieces?
Chattering, the chatter.
The chatter. So everybody is chattering, everyone's chattering, and everybody is swapping their government debt for the new shares.
Yeah.
Now, once that all is eliminated, law still is a problem. The demand for these shares is going through the roof. And he says, okay, brilliant. I've got another scam here.
Yeah.
I'm going to convince the king, the Donald Trump in this case, to make the general bank that I have already set up the Royal Bank.
Right.
And we're
What
going
does
to
that do
change
then?
the name, and we are going to make sure that all the taxes of France are paid through this bank.
Okay.
So
right.
basically, there is a one-man leveraged buyout of an entire country. All the while, the king is getting rich, the court are
so
getting
he's
rich.
cool, yeah.
On paper, everyone's loaded. Prices are rising, and they are rising at stratospheric levels. Now, this has all happened before. Remember the Dutch East India company we took? So the Dutch had done this. They got very rich, but it was much more substantial. This was all flannel. This was all hot air.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because what was actually in the French territories were swamps, mosquitoes.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
You know, and
Alligators.
Alligators, and there was no people down there. There was very few. There were French kind of trappers, you know, and backwoods men. But they were painting a picture of basically the Caribbean. A bit like the Gaz Riviera, right?
Yes, yeah.
You know, painting a picture, right? But actually the reality was the place was impossible. It took generations, but nobody wanted to hear that stuff.
Yeah.
So, John, these share prices were going through the roof, astronomical, right? And that was generating enormous amounts of money for the people who were issuing the shares. And who was issuing the shares? Law himself.
Yes.
Right? So he's sitting in
conflict of interest.
Sitting right in the middle of this.
Yeah.
He now owns the state bank, the Royal Bank. The Royal Bank is issuing paper money. The paper money is now backed by the shares, not gold or silver. So the country's been flooded with new money. Everybody's feeling really rich. The whole thing is flying along. The expression millionaire is a French expression. It comes from this period.
Right, okay.
Because people were on paper worth 1 million livres, which is the French franc before it became the French franc.
Right, okay.
So everything's flying. It's the most, it's like the NASDAQ.
It's another massive bubble.
Massive. It's like the unicorns, all that stuff we talked about, right? And there's a mass extinction event, as there always is, right? And Law, 25 years after he had escaped the hangman in England, Law is now sitting at the center of French finance. So much so that the king makes him the Minister of Finance.
Of course he
France,
would.
right?
Of course he would.
So think about this, right? This is the guy, he owns the bank. He gets all the favors from the king.
Yeah.
The king is in his pocket. Everyone thinks he's a genius. He is the richest man in the world. Shares are going through the roof. The more shares go up, the more people think he's a genius. It's a self-reinforcing adulation of the geezer. Does he remind you of somebody?
Yeah.
And he's sitting in the middle of all this.
You have to give him credit, though, as well, because the ideas that he came up with were fantastic.
The ideas and the most important thing, he proved that paper money works.
Yeah.
That you can divorce paper money from gold, and people will spend it, and it will be used. And if you inject more paper money into the system, you can create conditions of economic boom, which is basically what most central banking is all about now.
Yeah. But what made him the true genius, though, was the fact that he was a marketing genius.
He was a marketing genius.
He owned the story.
Right. He owned the story. You're absolutely right.
Like our spacer friend.
Yeah, he owned the story. And he owned the king as well.
Yeah.
And the king's fortunes were tied up with his fortunes. And the entire thing was based on the notion of more and more people coming in, buying shares, getting rich, fellas getting out of the top, but selling on to people at the bottom. So bizarre, John, and so intense was the frenzy of speculation in France that in the street of the Rue Quincampoix,
Right.
which was the Wall Street of France,
Yeah.
where all the brokers were. There was so much stuff going down, with people writing down, I owe you money, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
that a famous hunchback of the Rue Quincampoix
Yeah.
offered his hump as a table for people to trade shares on.
Did he come down from Notre Dame?
The same as his brother. So, and there's a great image of it. There's a great image. There's some wonderful images from this period.
So what happened that the bubble burst?
This is the fascinating thing. So the greatest compliment the British could ever give the French was to copy the French in issues of money.
Right.
So the British always felt that the French, they still do, were basically a bunch of preening wasters when it came to money. So the Brits saw this stuff in the Mississippi Company and they were like, wow, the French are onto something here.
Yeah.
And we can't be besmirched by this bunch of frogs. So we're going to have our own gig. And the British had a copycat scheme called the South Sea Company. And that was the South Sea bubble where our friend Jonathan Swift coined the term bubble.
Yes.
About this, right? So Swift is sitting in Ireland and he's going over to London. And he's like, everyone's obsessed by this.
Yeah.
And big parts of George and Dublin were built during this effervescence.
Right.
So it created lots of interesting things, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Brits follow the French and the British do exactly the same thing. They buy a company. Now, the fascinating thing was who buys the company?
Yeah.
So John Law, the murderer, is at the center of French finance. Who is at the center of British finance 25 years after the murder? The guy they believe contracted Law to do the killing, Spencer, Charles Spencer. And Charles Spencer,
God, it's all tied
Charles
together
Spencer is
beautifully.
Diana Spencer's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad.
Okay.
So he is the ancestor of the future King of England, King William.
Wow.
Isn't that an amazing story, right? So they're all involved in this sort of thing. And as all these things happen, it's like happening in the NASDAQ today.
Yeah.
Why are the shares of Palantir falling? I don't know. They just are. The mood changes. Why are the shares of NASDAQ companies falling? Nothing really has happened.
Yes.
It's just the mood has changed. The leverage is too much. And suddenly what you find is like all these boom bust cycles. Somebody sells, next person sells. Suddenly the stampede of buyers turns into a stampede of sellers. The pendulum moves from greed to fear. Share prices start to fall. As share prices start to fall, John Law, sitting at the center of the system, begins to try and create all sorts of other false demands for share. He can't do this. Share prices collapse. I'll give you...
So he loses control of the story, of the narrative.
Control of the narrative. You're absolutely right. And of course, then people's paper wealth, which is all based on the notional values of the share, collapses.
Yeah.
And not for the first time. So this is in February 1720. Shares begin to wobble. People start to sell. Everyone starts to sell. In December 1720, not for the first time, John Law has to skip yet another country and ends up in Venice,
right,
where he ends up a casino maestro, builds up an extraordinary art collection and dies peacefully.
Oh.
But the question is, are we seeing something similar? Are we seeing the same type of individuals, the same type of effervescence, as you say, the same sort of story being generated, the same sort of speculative madness in, XAI?
Yeah.
Twitter with a bit of AI stuck onto it,
Yeah.
I mean, these are like startup scams that are now worth 50 billion. And if the market turns, as it looks like doing now, and if Jay Powell doesn't come in and bail everybody out, do you get a scenario that Law offers the blueprint for Musk? The regent is the king, as Trump is the king, and the effervescence disappears almost as quickly as it emerges when people realize that the future is always unknowable. Because what all the tech bros are saying is we can see the future.
Yeah.
But the only thing we know as normal citizens, human beings, is we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen in 10 years' time. Musk wants to live on Mars. Now, let's think about this, right? I mean, John fucking Law didn't say he wanted to live on Mars, right? At least Law was in the...
Yeah, Mississippi was probably as close to
Mars as you get. But the story now, I'll tell you, one of the most fascinating, and the end game of the story, John, is Law disappears in total and utter scandal. Spencer in England loses his job in total and utter scandal. The French decide after the total travesty, millions of people have lost everything, that they will never innovate with finance again. So much so that the word bank becomes so toxic that the French banks refuse to call themselves banks. For 100 years after the scandal, they called themselves cassis de dépôt, which means deposit holders.
Right.
And because the French refused to innovate in finance, their tax system in the years leading up to the revolution was so draconian and so backward that basically every time the king needed money, he just taxed the peasants.
Yeah.
They never innovated.
Yeah.
And eventually the peasants said, I'm not having that. So the roots of the French Revolution lie in the economics of John Law, who was an impostor, who inveigled his way into the French court, and in so doing set the seeds of the destruction of the French monarchy. So there you have it.
Ooh.